book at some stage the world spend on healthcare is going to reach something like $47 trillion by 2030. So I guess just to start off, what's going on in the world with this ridiculous trend?
Yeah, so I mean that's more than the GDP of the 6 largest economies in the world, just to put that in perspective. I mean, that's such a big number, it's hard to even get your head around it. Most people have no idea how to even conceive of $1 trillion, much less 47 trillion.
Crazy.
So yeah, I mean that we're talking about like bankruptcy on a global scale, and the reason for that is that chronic disease is incredibly difficult to treat using our conventional system. It lasts often for a lifetime. And the way that our healthcare, or rather sick care or disease management system is set up is just woefully inadequate for dealing with it. I mean, it's really fantastic if you get hit by a car, or you have some kind of injury, or you need to get a colonoscopy or some other kind of procedure like that. Conventional medicine is fantastic. And, we should be grateful for all of the advances that we've had over the years, antibiotics and, more sanitary conditions in the operating room that prevent infections, and, pretty remarkable technologies that allow us to do things like reattach limbs and do organ transplants, and it's amazing, it's incredible, and we should be grateful for that. But trying to use those same methodologies that were really designed to treat acute emergency problems to address chronic disease is a bit like using a hammer to screw in a screw. It's the wrong tool for the job.
Yeah,
no, exactly. And I think I read either in the book or in the Joe Rogan episodes you did, which we loved, that you said, like, as you say, this chronic stuff, someone who gets diabetes, it's something like $14,000 a year to treat. And as you say, that could go on for 40, 50 years. Whereas the cure or just not, or preventing it in the first place is a lot cheaper than $14,000 a year.
Yeah. I mean, now the average age of people being diagnosed with diabetes is dropping every year. Used to be unheard of for a kid to be diagnosed with diabetes, much less an adolescent. And now we have 8-year-olds that are being diagnosed with diabetes. We have 20% of adolescents, at least in the U.S. I'm not sure of the numbers in Australia, but I doubt they're very different. About 20% of adolescents, kids, are obese, not just overweight, obese.
That's
so it's crazy. It's so unnatural. That's obviously not normal for human beings. And the problem with that, as you pointed out, is these expenditures, which are already astronomical and already bringing our system to its knees, are going to be extended now for another decade, another 2 decades, or even another 3 decades. And there's just no way. If you do that math, $14,000 times 60 or 70 years, that's $1 million just for one disease and one patient lifetime. And that's how you get very quickly to that $50 trillion number that we were talking about before.
Crazy.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of our economies are going to drown. Today, so it's like 9 a.m. on a Sunday. Today, I'm going to see my granddad, have lunch with him, and it was not long ago, I remember him being this powerful man. He played football for Chelsea and all this kind of stuff, but he's been hit with Alzheimer's at the moment. So I'd love to know where does this disease come from? Because it seems like everyone in their old age kind of hits it. And I try and sell kind of health principles on some people I know, and they say Alzheimer's, they just didn't have a label for it back in the day, like, when they were younger. Is this the case, or is it actual proof that Alzheimer's is growing? And it seems to be kind of expected at the moment, but it really is a horrible disease. And see, someone you used to, or you love, forget your name when you, and things like that. It's really hard.
Oh, it's devastating. I think I read a statistic at some point that most people would rather die in a shark attack than Alzheimer's, which is pretty vivid, like, and I would put myself on that list for sure. Like, it's devastating. disease for the people who are suffering from it, but even more than that, for their families, as you know. It's really hard on people around the person who's suffering from that condition. And when they want to study how stress affects people, they study caregivers of Alzheimer's patients. That's pretty common in the research literature. But to your question, no, it's definitely not just a normal thing that's always been going on that now has a name and that's been more recognized. That's been debunked. There definitely is an increase in the incidence of it, a pretty alarming increase, as with many other chronic diseases like autism, for example. And if you look at hunter-gatherer populations, that those few that still exist in other parts of the world, like the Tsimane, for example, in Bolivia, they're a subsistence farming hunter-gatherer population that's largely maintained their traditional diet and lifestyle. They have an even higher incidence of ApoE4 polymorphisms, that the ones that increase your susceptibility to Alzheimer's, at least in the West. But their incidence of Alzheimer's is far, far lower than ours is today. So that already shoots a hole in the theory that it's just bad luck. If you have bad genes, you're going to get it. It doesn't matter what you do or don't do, which is basically what doctors are telling patients now. If that were true, then we would see everybody in the Tsimane population getting Alzheimer's because they have a very high prevalence of this genetic mutation. But that doesn't happen. So that tells us there's something in our diet, something in our environment, something in our behavior that is increasing this risk. You could look at that as bad news, but I look at that as good news because that means there's actually something that we can do to prevent it and maybe even reverse it once it's started. Have you heard of Dale Bredesen's book on Alzheimer's?
I have not.
Yeah, so you'll probably be going to buy this right after I tell you about it,
totally,
because he is a doctor who has spent his entire career treating, and studying Alzheimer's from a conventional perspective. He was very conventional doctor and was, working in the lab, and also working with patients at UCLA. Very prestigious institutions, well recognized around the world for his research in the conventional approach. But after, 2 decades of working that way and just feeling like he was banging his head up against a brick wall and getting nowhere, he started to question whether this approach of just trying to find a drug that would magically erase the condition was the right way to go about it. And he started to also think about things from an ancestral perspective, like, hey, populations like the Tsimane, like we just talked about, they don't get Alzheimer's. So they have the same genes. They don't get it. There must be something going on in the environment. Anyways, he basically came to a functional medicine approach to Alzheimer's on his own without knowing even that there was such a thing as functional medicine. And then he started diagnosing and treating Alzheimer's by looking at what could be the underlying causes and what happens if we actually address those causes. Do people get better? And the answer was unequivocally yes. And so he wrote a book, just came out in August, in the US at least. I'm not sure if it's available over where you guys are, but it's called The End of Alzheimer's, the first program to prevent and reverse cognitive decline. And he shares about all of his experience working with patients from this new perspective and how much more powerful and effective it is and how much more hopeful it is. Because, most people when they're diagnosed with Alzheimer's, it's just like, pack it up, just totally. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a lot of our diseases. We'll just go straight to the doctor, and like you say in the book, it's like a passive thing. So we just look for the doctor for the solution, and then we've only got 10 minutes with them. So then pretty much that's the only enough time to just give us a prescription drug, and it's a Band-Aid, and off we go. So I'm keen to hear a little bit about big pharma and the incentive structure at the moment, because the way it's set up, you say in the book, it's they're not inclined to, or they're not going to win if we actually get healthier. They get paid more if we just have a decline of health. Yeah,
I mean it's a bigger problem here than it is in Australia. Not to say that it isn't an issue there, but we along with your neighbors in New Zealand, are the only two countries in the world that allow direct-to-consumer drug advertising. So you can open a magazine here, and you see the first 10 pages are like full page spread advertisements for Viagra or whatever other drug that they're selling. And then what happens is you get patients going into the doctor saying, I want that drug, even when it's not appropriate for their condition. And doctors often end up prescribing it because they just get worn down. So we have a lot of weird stuff here in the US where the pharmaceutical companies have a lot more influence than they need to or should compared to other countries in the world, even other industrialized countries. And the result of that is that big pharma has an incredible amount of sway over decisions that are made, from a public policy perspective. They spend, let me see if I remember the number off the top of my head, $250 million a year lobbying Congress. And to put that in perspective, the gun lobby, which gets a lot of attention, in the U.S., the NRA and other associated organizations that are lobbying for gun rights, they spend only $10 million.
What?
So, yeah, the big pharma is spending 25 times more than the gun lobby to make sure that legislation that is favorable to them gets passed. And a recent example of this is that I'm sure you've heard of the opioid epidemic here in the U.S., where opiate addiction is just really on the rise. It's killing, a really sad, extremely devastating number of people all across the U.S., but particularly in the Midwest. And there are pharmacies in small towns like in West Virginia that are ordering an unbelievable number of opioid pills. They have a population of like 10,000 people, and they're ordering hundreds of thousands of opioid pills. And it's very clear what's happening, right? That, people are doctors are giving out prescriptions more than they should. There's some probably unethical doctors that are doing it for money. And there was a movement to pass legislation that would make that impossible, that would regulate more the prescription of opiates so that we could save some lives and keep people from getting addicted to these drugs. And the pharmaceutical lobby basically blocked that. They did what they do, and magically that bill disappeared. And there was no justification for that. There's no viable reason that should have been blocked other than money. And that's that's one of the biggest obstacles we face to the plan that I laid out in the book, because these are deeply entrenched financial interests. That the pharmaceutical industry is second only to the oil industry in the U.S. in terms of the amount of profit they make each year. So they're not going to just roll over and play dead, and give that up. But at the same time, the fact that in Australia and in the UK and in Scandinavia and many other industrialized, countries around the world don't have big pharma doesn't have that influence, and ultimately the people do make the laws. So if there's enough groundswell of understanding and outcry and outrage and awareness is raised to a certain level, I think we can make changes that will make a difference.
Nice, that's phenomenal. We've read a bunch of the books that we've done talks about Pfizer and stuff, and one of the interviews a guy we did talked, it's called The Click Moment, a dude named Franz Johansson. He talked about how it's about being open to randomness and using that for business. And their randomness was that they had this pill for lowering blood pressure. Turns out it gave people boners, which was obviously a good thing. But I'd like to, a different take on it that I heard you talking about was that they actually then went and invented a disease. They hired an advertising agent to create erectile dysfunction. And then people thought, I need a pill for that.
Yeah, this is a phenomenon called disease mongering. And there are actually studies about it. You can Google it. It's a term. The definition is that the practice of widening the diagnostic boundaries of illnesses and aggressively promoting their public awareness in order to expand the markets for treatment. So
It's crazy.
So yeah, and there are books written on it. I've read several papers on it, and as I was talking with Joe Rogan about it, basically about 20 years ago, and there's even a CEO from Merck that's quoted publicly saying this, but they realized that the market for selling drugs was getting saturated because they had produced many of the drugs for sicknesses that they could produce, and they realized that they were kind of reaching the limit of that. I mean, certainly there would be new sicknesses and new drugs, but they kind of understood that there wouldn't be a game-changing increase in revenue unless they figured out how to sell drugs to healthy people. Because, there's way more healthy people than there are sick people, or at least, I'm using air quotes for healthy, but, people who aren't taking drugs for chronic illness. And so the key was to break into this new market. It's almost the equivalent of like Google going to China or something. All of a sudden there's billions of people that you can sell to that you weren't selling to before. But, healthy people don't think they need to take drugs, right? They're healthy. Why would they take a drug? So the way that you answer that question is to create new conditions and then make healthy people believe that they're suffering from them. And then you can sell drugs for those conditions. And so erectile dysfunction is one of the most notable examples of disease mongering. Another example is ADHD and ADD. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't legitimate symptoms of ADHD and ADD. And of course, it also doesn't mean that people don't suffer from erectile dysfunction. But the lines start to blur. You start to, let's take a child, for example, who is just a high energy kid who's really precocious and smart and is in school and is bored out of his brain because it's not challenging him. It's not what he's interested in doing. And he's being asked to sit in a row of desks, and like as soon as he gets interested in something, the bell rings and he has to get up and go to the next thing just because somebody tells him, that's a totally artificial system. And if a kid doesn't fit into that, he's diagnosed with ADHD, like that's the part that's disease mongering. That may be a normal response to that kind of system for a kid like that, but it's turned into a pathology. So there are lots of other examples, but they've been very successful. And they, like you said, they do hire advertising agencies to create these conditions and then market them to the public.
That's absolutely crazy. Absolutely crazy. One of the things you talked about a lot is returning to an ancestral way of eating and lifestyle. And I like that you talked about paleo, which is probably a good way to summarize it, but it's also got a lot of negative stigma attached to it. And people probably have met someone who's ramming some paleo something down their throat. As I get a bit of a paleo stuck in my throat now. Can you tell us your version of paleo and what it means to live ancestrally and eat ancestrally?
Yeah, it's pretty simple, really, and it's just that all organisms and animals on the planet evolved in a certain environment, and they're adapted to survive and thrive in that environment. And when the environment changes faster than their genes or their biology can adapt, you get a mismatch. And that mismatch is the fundamental cause of all human disease, and all disease in any animal. So for just, again, to use an example, cats are carnivores in nature. They only eat meat. They don't eat salads. They don't eat grain-based kibble. They eat meat. That's what their digestive tract is designed for. That's the environment they evolved in. And if you feed a cat kibble, cat food from the pet food store that has grains and other stuff in it, they will survive, but they won't thrive because their digestive system is not adapted for that. And when you go in now to a pet food store, at least in the States, all of the premium cat food is meat only or raw meat, because veterinarians have realized this, and they know that cats will be healthy if they're eating a species appropriate diet is one way to think about it. So what is the human species appropriate diet? How do we figure that out? Well, we look at groups of humans that are still living their traditional lifestyle, like the Simane that I mentioned before, but you also have the Hadza in Africa, which are often considered to be the last really truly remaining hunter-gatherer culture in the world. You have the Kitaba, which are closer to you guys in the South Pacific. You've got the people in the Tukasenta in the Papua New Guinea highlands, which is also near you. You've got the Ache in Paraguay. So you've got these groups of people all around the world, and without exception, they ate some combination of meat and fish, fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, and lots of different starchy plants. It varied from place to place. Sometimes they ate more fat, sometimes they ate less fat, more protein, less protein. But what they weren't eating was cheese doodles, cookies, cakes, candy, pizza, chicken nuggets, bread, all of the foods that now make up the majority of calories in the American diet. But it's not just about diet. It's also about things like physical activity, sleep, exposure to light, stress. And when you look at these traditional cultures, they didn't sit for long periods. They're naturally active throughout the day. They lived in sync with the natural rhythms of light and dark. They weren't exposed to artificial light and iPads and screens all the time. They got 7 to 9 hours of sleep on average each night. They lived in close-knit tribal and social groups. And this is basically one way to think of it is like the natural human operating system, and that's just like a computer requires a certain kind of operating system. The hardware of the computer, the hardware of our bodies, which is our genes, requires a certain kind of operating system to run properly. And if you try to install Windows on a Mac, it's not gonna go well. And that's basically what's happened today in our industrialized world.
Oh, totally. For myself and all the listeners, we probably have installed Windows on a Mac.
Yeah.
So assuming that we've probably lived, 20, 30, 40 years or whatever, eating the wrong stuff, eating chicken nuggets, drinking beer and eating cheese or whatever, that kind of stuff. And for me,
fish and chips, right?
Fish and chips, pies if you're in Australia.
Pies, I remember my pies there when I visited.
Yeah, they're good.
Good
pies. For me, last year was antibiotics as well. And I think in your story, you had a big dose of antibiotics in your 20s also. So what's the some of the easiest or lowest hanging fruit to improve our health again?
Well, going back to studying traditional peoples and finding the common threads in all of their diets, no matter where they were in the world, virtually all traditional peoples ate some form of fermented foods. So these would be things like sauerkraut, or later, once dairy consumption started, kefir or yogurt, beet kvass, kombucha, all kinds of different fermented foods and beverages, kimchi in Korea and Asian food. And these, they didn't know anything about bacteria or microbes, or they just, through process of trial and error and experimentation, figured out that these foods were healthy, and they were, and they made them feel better. And also, fermentation was the only way to store foods without refrigeration. So, eating fermented food, I think, is something that's fallen out of favor in Western culture, but it's one of the easiest things that you can do to promote your gut health, especially after you've taken a lot of antibiotics. But not just that, also eating fermentable fiber. So one thing that we've come to understand over the last 10 or 20 years is that fiber is crucial not for us per se, but for the bacteria that live in our gut, because fiber is food for those bacteria. So by definition, fiber is a type of carbohydrate that humans can't absorb, but that the bacteria living in our gut can. And so one way to think about it is, with each bite of food you put in your mouth, you ask yourself the question, how will this nourish me? And how will it nourish the bacteria in my gut? And if, ideally the best kinds of foods are the foods that are going to do both. They're going to nourish you and they're going to nourish the bacteria in your gut. So eating fermented foods, eating fermentable fibers, those are mostly found in lots of different fresh fruits and vegetables, starchy plants, like I mentioned before, onions, garlic, leeks, Jerusalem artichokes. There's mushrooms. There are a lot of different kinds of foods that have different types of fibers. And we want to eat as wide a variety of these as we can.
Cool.
Sorry, can I quickly jump? I'm glad to hear. We've been on a kombucha kick the last 3 or 4 weeks. I'm glad to hear. We were worried it was just good marketing, but I'm glad to hear that maybe there's something to it. But
yeah,
sorry,
I mean, I don't think it's as therapeutic as like sauerkraut or beet kvass or something like that. But I think it's beneficial overall as long as you don't overdo it, because kombucha has some sugar in it, right? Mm-hmm. Not a lot. Certainly not like drinking a big gulp, but it's I've seen people that are they're like, oh, I'm drinking kombucha. Is that good for me? And I was like, how much you drinking? They're like 5 a day. I'm like, no, that's not good for you.
And what about probiotics? Is that we probably just sound like lazy idiots just trying to take the easy way out.
Take a probiotic.
No, that's
for a lot
fine.
of people, do probiotics actually work? And taking supplements, those kind of supplements, if because a lot of those foods you mentioned there, I've never even heard of, and if I walk through a grocery store, I wouldn't even know what any of this looks like. So,
well, not if you're in Byron Bay, you might.
Yeah,
exactly. So probiotics. The problem is, it's kind of like saying, is beer good? Like does beer taste good? Well, there's a big difference, between this beer and that beer, and everyone's got their ideas about which are better and which aren't, but there's just a huge quality difference, and a lot of products on the market don't have what they say they have in them, and they're not as effective as they should be for that reason. The other issue, at least for me, is that I know that you guys, I used to treat patients from all over the world. I don't accept patients internationally anymore, but when I did, and I had patients from Australia, a lot of the products that I recommended from here were not available there. So it's a little harder for me to make specific recommendations. But and it's one of the reasons I come back to fermented foods, because number one, they're cheaper. Mm-hmm. Number two, they actually tend to have much more probiotic organisms in them. Like a glass of kefir, for example, has trillions of microorganisms versus billions or maybe hundreds of billions in some of the more powerful probiotics. And number three, you can be relatively sure that they have what they're supposed to have in them, which is not the case for commercial probiotics. Having said all that, yes, there are lots of probiotics that can be very effective. I use them with my patients every day in my practice, and I recommend them for people who want to maintain good gut health. I guess I would say, choosing species that have been well studied and brands that are reputable rather than just the cheapest thing that's available in the market is a really good idea, because there's just a lot of false claims that are being made about them.
Nice. In general, I heard you say a quote, anyone trying to be healthy and lean is fighting an upstream battle. And you talked about how the layouts of grocery stores and things like that, and advertising, and everyone trying to get us to eat crap, essentially. So what are some of the ways that I guess...
It's even deeper than that, because... human beings evolved in an environment of food scarcity. So what that means is our entire operating system, again, is set up to prevent us from starving, because that was the main threat for a vast majority of human history. It still is in many parts of the world, right? We're fortunate. We live in the industrialized world. Food abundance is a bigger problem for us now. But in most places in history, and even still today, food scarcity is the biggest problem. So we have all of these mechanisms in our brain to protect us against starvation. So we seek out highly rewarding, calorie-dense foods, because from an evolutionary perspective, the people who are most successful at bulking up and eating those calorie-dense foods would be the ones who would be most likely to survive a famine and, pass their genes on to the next generation. So that's all well and good when you're living in an environment of food scarcity, but it backfires on us when you've got, a supermarket on every corner, or a, pie shop or fish and chips shop, and, a liquor store on every corner. Like that's a horrible setup, because it's a perfect storm for our brains, which are designed to seek out those rewarding foods. And so going against that hardwired genetic programming is very difficult. It's not, I often tell my patients who are struggling, it's not about like, you're weak, you don't have willpower. You have to understand that you're fighting against survival mechanisms. It's for your body thinks that it's going to starve. That's the level that you're up against. And of course you're not, but your body, this is a deeper thing. This is like limbic system, lizard brain kind of stuff. It's not like at the level of conscious thought. Yeah. So what that means is we have to be very smart about how we set up our environment, our food environment. For example, don't keep a bag of potato chips in your cupboard, because if you get home from work and you're stressed out and you're tired and you're hungry and that bag of potato chips is in there, what's going to happen? You're going to open it up. You're going to start looking at your iPhone or your iPad, and you're going to be eating those things. And before you know it, they're going to be gone, because they are actually designed to get you to eat all of them. And these companies have food scientists that understand all of the brain mechanisms that lead to consumption of food. And they make sure that their packaged foods hit every single one of those buttons that's going to make you overeat. And that's what they're paid to do. So, it's not a conspiracy. It's just the way things work. And so when you understand the way things work, you can actually set your life up in a way that counters that.
Yeah. You'd think with so much info, they could use it for good, not evil, but obviously not. They just want you to eat more chips.
They could. It's, again, I don't think this is a conspiracy. I think that food companies they're publicly held corporations. They're set up in capitalist society. They're set up to make money and reward their shareholders. And how do they do that? By selling more products. I mean, it's just absolutely without any judgment about whether the system is good or bad. It's the system that we have, and it's operating the way that it should from that perspective.
Yeah. Well, do you think are you optimistic that some of the incentives or some of the profits might be found in the more healthy options for big pharma and for big food? So eventually, as we said at the start, it's $47 trillion in healthcare by 2030. Surely they can get profits from, choosing the ADAPT framework that you propose in the book.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty complex topic, and it does actually vary a bit from country to country. So the answer I might give you for the US is a little bit different, perhaps, than for Australia and the UK. I think you can take a glass half full or glass empty approach to this, depending on what kind of person you are and, whether you're an optimist or a pessimist. The optimistic answer is that we will see the writing on the wall. We'll raise awareness about these statistics that, $47 trillion in healthcare expenditures, 1 in 2 Americans with chronic disease, 1 in 4 with multiple chronic diseases. Today's kids being the first generation that are expected to actually live shorter lifespans than their parents, which is just heartbreaking. I have a 6-year-old daughter. The optimistic view is that we'll see how we're heading, toward a cliff, and we will change course, through changes to our medical paradigm, changes to how we deliver care, changes to public policy, and we'll avert that catastrophe. Okay, so there's that. The glass half empty perspective is that we will continue to do exactly what we're doing now, and the healthcare system will continue to buckle under the growing burden of chronic disease. I mean, it's already in a very precarious position here in the U.S. And as more and more people acquire and develop chronic disease, it'll place a greater and greater burden on the system, and it will fall apart. It will actually just completely fall apart, and it will become blatantly apparent at that point that we cannot go on with business as usual as we have been before. And then at that time, we'll finally have the political will to make the changes that need to be made, because we'll realize that it's truly a matter of the survival of our species and the survival of our country as a distinct government entity, So we're not just talking about individual health here. Like, it's not just about me getting my beach body or, like dealing with a chronic illness. For me, it's about the survival of governments, the survival of states as we know them. It's about the survival of our species, perhaps. Like, we're seeing alarming declines in sperm count in males over the past 20 years. And if we can't procreate as a species, then that's game over. Nothing else matters. So I want to emphasize the seriousness of this problem. It's not just an individual problem. It's a social and even species-wide problem and challenge that we're facing.
Yeah, that's powerful stuff. I hope it is that we realize before it's too late, before it's a necessity. But I don't know.
I'm holding out for that. I mean, I wrote that's why I wrote the book.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I still have some hope that will happen, and I want to be a part of that change. And I do believe that we'll get there one way or the other. I just hope it will be a lot less painful to take the proactive route. Yeah. There's a lot less pain and suffering in that. And there's already so much as it is that I would hate to see more added. At the same time, if you're a student of history, it's hard to truly believe that things will change as quickly as they do need to change in order for us to turn around the ship. But all we can do is try.
Yeah. Nice. I've got one cheeky little left fielder before we ask you about some of the books on the shelf behind you and where people could find you and stuff. You talked about the potato hack on Joe Rogan. Yeah. I don't know if you probably know the magician Penn Jillette, how he wrote a book about how he lost 100 pounds. He ate just potatoes for a month to sort of break all the bad habits that he developed about eating and stuff. Is the potato hack something you recommend, and what are some of the warnings or cautions around that?
It's pretty legit. I mean,
I might give it a crack this week.
The funny thing is, shortly after I was on Rogan, I went down to Mexico to do some surfing, and for my, I do twice a year. I do a 10-day digital detox where I go completely off the grid, and so we went down to Baja, and then I came back and I got back online, and I saw that almost my entire company, we have the clinic and then also my online training business, about 20 employees between the two companies, and something like literally like 15 of people were on the potato hack, and several had lost like 10 pounds in 20 days and, just having incredible results. So it definitely works, and it can often work when nothing else works. And there are a lot of reasons for that. We talked before about how our brain is hardwired to seek out really rewarding, calorie-dense foods with a lot of variety. All of those things are the things that make us eat more than we actually need to satisfy our hunger. When you eat plain potatoes, you're short-circuiting all of those mechanisms. And again, to use an example, imagine two plates of food next to each other. On one, you have just steamed potatoes with no salt, no fat, nothing, just steamed white potato. And on the other, you've got potato chips, Yeah. Goes without saying that for most people, for the potato, they're just going to eat only as much as they need to satisfy their hunger, not a bite more.
Yeah.
But the potato chips, even if you've already had a full meal, a lot of people will just eat the whole plate of the potato chips because that's just how it goes. And so, but the other thing is when you cook the potatoes and cool them, which most people do, when they're doing this diet, they make a huge batch of potatoes on Sunday, and then they just eat those throughout the week, put them in the fridge, heat them back up maybe. When you do that, resistant starch forms, and resistant starch is a fiber that feeds our beneficial gut bacteria. So I think the other reason that the potato hack works is it's like a gut reset. And we know that the gut, of course, is really important in terms of weight regulation. So it's legit. It works. It works when nothing else will work. If you do it, and you're going to do it over an extended period of time, taking a high quality multivitamin is probably a good idea. I think there are strategies for doing it different ways that might make more sense. Like there's a version called potatoes by day where you just eat potatoes for breakfast and lunch, and then you have a normal dinner, with your family or your girlfriend or your boyfriend or, so that way you can have kind of a more normal social existence in the evenings. And then just during the day when you're busy and you don't have to want to worry about food, you just eat the potatoes. And that's a good way of doing it. Another way of doing it is just doing like 2 days a week, 2-3 days a week. You do Monday and Tuesday or something. And, you could expect for some people to lose anywhere between 1/4 pound and 1/2 pound per day of doing the potato diet. So if you do the potato diet 2 days a week, then, if you're on the top end of that scale, you might lose 1 pound a week. And so if you did it over a year, you could lose 50 pounds, which is pretty significant. So it doesn't have to be super fast and concentrated. You can spread it out and just make it more sustainable.
That's huge. Get on it, Ash. So you got a huge bookcase behind you with a bunch of books. What books have been influential on your career or and your life, I guess, and your work?
Mostly books that are not about health, actually.
Nice.
I would say, I read very few health books. I mostly read studies, the original studies. I have several RSS feeds. I don't know if people even know what those are anymore. I'm probably giving away my age here, but basically it's a way of getting alerted when new studies are published on topics that I'm interested in. And so I have, I read a ton of original research, and then I read some blogs that you guys probably haven't even heard of that are just from scientists and researchers that I know in the community that write about their research. That's mostly how I get my health education in, more so than popular books. But I read pretty widely across a lot of different genres. Right now I am reading Leonardo da Vinci's biography. By Walter Isaacson, which is he's just an incredible innovator, inventor, dreamer. I read Einstein's biography shortly before that. Same thing be said about him. I'm reading a book called Irresistible about the rise of addictive technologies like the internet and smartphones, which is terrifying. And, frankly, it's affecting me probably more than just about any other book I've read recently. I read books on cosmology. I recently read Brian Greene's book about the multiverse, 7 different theories about the multiverse. Nice. I read books about physics and astrophysics, poetry, just a whole, mostly nonfiction, occasionally some fiction. And I find that reading across those different genres really makes me think about things in a different way and opens my mind to other possibilities that I might not be thinking about if I was, just reading health books or just reading fiction.
That's awesome. I think that's a good recommendation. There's a few books to add to our list off the back of that. We're heading to Indonesia soon, so we're going to try and avoid that 10-year disease.
Don't go to Lake Ikea. No. You can go there. Just don't. Just keep your fingers crossed. It was an unusual situation, but I'm sure you guys have heard of plenty of people, Aussies, getting sick in Indonesia.
Oh, for sure. Thanks so much for your time. It was phenomenal. Whereabouts can people find more about you and the work you're doing and the revolution that you're building?
So my main website is chriskresser.com, and that's where I've got a ton of free ebooks and articles about maintaining your individual health, treating chronic disease, optimizing your lifespan, your performance. For practitioners that are interested in training in this approach that we've been talking about today, addressing the root cause of disease rather than just suppressing symptoms and putting Band-Aids on it. KresserInstitute.com is my training organization, and we have a program for licensed clinicians like medical doctors and naturopathic physicians, nurse practitioners, etc. We actually have had a few Australian physicians go through the program, which is great. And then next year, I'm launching a health coach training program, actually, because I believe that health coaches are going to be a crucial part of how we address chronic disease. Because, as I said before, chronic disease is basically a diet, lifestyle, and behavior problem, and a mismatch between our diet and lifestyle and behavior and our genes and our biology. And so the best people really to address that would be health coaches. There'll never be enough doctors to address it, and they don't have time to do it. So we can train health coaches pretty quickly to do that. So that's KresserInstitute.com. And then my book is at unconventionalmedicinebook.com. And you can actually download the first 3 chapters for free on that website. And then if you want to buy the book, it's on Amazon.